Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Zoe, and I am very excited to be in Singapore today, about to present this topic tomorrow at the APBAM conference. My voice is a little croaky. I came down with something yesterday, but bear with me because I wanted to deliver this session in an online format for those that are not able to attend the conference, and also to do a more condensed, shorter snapshot of the area of post-traumatic growth. A little bit about me for context before we jump into the topic. I'm originally from Melbourne, Australia, and have been a Deakin University student for what felt like a very long time. I went back to study social work in my early 30s and continued into a PhD. My PhD was based in Cambodia, where I looked at trauma and resilience. I worked in an inpatient treatment setting also around that time. I spent 5 years living in Southeast Asia, largely divided between Thailand, where I was working as a trauma therapist, and Cambodia, which of course was the host country and backdrop to my doctoral research. I wrapped up my PhD in 2020 and I immigrated to Mauritius. During this time, I have continued to work in a clinical capacity, but I also do a lot of training and development work, especially in the trauma and mental health space. I consult with Fortune 500 and organizations around the world. I also have clients all across the globe, which is wonderful for me because I continue to learn. I have been affiliated with Promises for a bit over a year now, and once again, super excited to be here in Singapore. So let's begin. Post-traumatic growth is essentially a relatively new area. You can see here it was developed by Tedeschi and Calhoun back in 96. And when we look at the literature around trauma, what we see is post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, interventions for trauma. We see symptoms of trauma. We see that in my area, we are looking for various interventions to help people recover. And Tedeschi and Calhoun brought to the table a sort of new framework or a way of looking at it, even though one might argue that elements of post-traumatic growth have been very present in the research, and certainly in terms of faith-based context and also how people may grow in the aftermath of trauma. But when we look at what does the statistics tell us, post-traumatic growth is actually more common than PTSD. You have two and a half more times the chance of having some elements of post-traumatic growth. But one thing that's important to remember is one does not cancel out the other, and they can essentially co-occur. And when we look at the transformative potential of trauma in an addiction setting, for an example, I have worked with clients that have been recovering from addiction early on in their recovery, and it's not necessarily a time for a discussion around post-traumatic growth. In my clinical work, I have the privilege of working with clients. A lot of them are in mid to long-term recovery, so 2 to 7 years, my current caseload, which means that many of them have had trauma because, one, addiction is trauma, which is often rooted in past traumas. And many of my clients have experienced trauma of various kinds. And what they have experienced later on sometimes is nothing short of remarkable. And similarly, I became interested in this area was through my research. When I was in Cambodia interviewing trauma survivors that had a history of trafficking and modern day slavery, I saw many, many examples of post-traumatic growth. And we're going to be unpacking those areas in just a moment. There is a critique of this model, essentially. It does not rule out mental health outcomes, and also it is relatively new, and some of the critique has been around how culture interplays with growth and how we might experience these different elements of growth differently. particularly when we're looking at individualistic cultures, such as America, versus a more collectivist culture, as a lot of countries in Asia are, and other areas of the world. So there has been some critique that it might be too simplistic to really capture the differences and variances in human nature. So these are the 5 elements of PTG that Tedeschi and Calhoun conceptualized. And according to Tedeschi, about his estimate was 89% of people experience at least one of these areas post-trauma. Beginning with personal strength. Trauma has the capacity to shake us to the very core. It can shift our worldview and our core beliefs. And sometimes people in the aftermath will realize that they have developed these coping skills. They have a new sense of resilience. And while I'm using the term resilience, I think it's important to note what is the difference between resilience and post-traumatic growth. So some of you will be familiar with the term, the ability to bounce back, as a way of describing resilience. I'm not a huge fan of that expression because humans are not rubber balls, but we also hear the ability to recover from adversity as a way of describing resilience. And yes, we might return to a state as we were before the event or the period of high stress and or adversity, where post-traumatic growth talks about the next step more than that. So we might find that people construct a really meaningful narrative around what happened to them. I had the pleasure of meeting an individual in Cambodia who is a psychologist working with children that have been sexually abused under the age of 12. And he himself was trafficked as a child. And he said to me during the interviews that he doesn't believe that he would be who he is today without all that bad stuff happening to him, was the way that he described it. He also said to me that during his teenage years, he was very angry and had some behavioral issues. And he said to me, there were 2 roads that presented. I was either going to become a psychologist and help people or a gangster. And I love that example because he said it with a smile, but I could see from his mannerisms that this was the other possibility for him. So we sometimes see people use what's happened to them as a way of constructing meaning. And new possibilities. Let's take an example from the field of addictions. Many people who are working in the addiction space are in recovery. We see this. This is not uncommon. But even when we look at global research, so for example, in the US, they did a very large study. There was over 5,000 social workers participated from different states, and 49% of social workers were diagnosed with a mental health issue before they started studying social work. And similarly with eating disorder research, up to 30%, according to one research study, of therapists working with eating disorders have had their own lived experiences of eating disorders. So we see people sometimes being compelled to help others, and it reshapes their narrative and it opens new possibilities that might not have been there pre-trauma. Connection is one of the key elements of recovery from trauma. So for the professionals that are listening to this, that certainly won't be groundbreaking information for you. What we find is that a lot of trauma is essentially at the hands of other humans, and that can create, well, a deep sense of distrust. But other times it can create a more of a focus on the supportive, loving relationships in someone's life. There is a deeper bond and more of a sense of importance that's placed on these key relationships. And this connection is key to recovery from trauma and certainly addictions. We see people that have come into recovery, and some of them have to cut ties with individuals that might create a high risk scenario. Some people have very dysfunctional families and they might need to put in really strong boundaries around this. But it is key that they find connection in amongst others. Jung had a beautiful way of describing Alcoholics Anonymous, and that was, he referred to it at one point as the protective wall of human community. And I love that for 12-step programs, because that is one of the areas that is provided a support group of other people who genuinely understand some of the struggles that an individual has gone through. Spiritual growth can be very different to different people. Yes, some people find solace in religion. There might be people who have more spiritual leanings. There's lots of different areas that can create a sense of faith and meaning through this. When I was living in Bangkok and I did a small research study before I embarked on my big piece of research. It was an assignment, and I chose to interview members of Alcoholics Anonymous that had long-term recovery, and I defined that as 10 or more years. And I remember one of the comments being, "I have a deep and profound sense of faith, but religion has nothing to do with who I am as a person." So sometimes, yes, it's religion. Other times it is a spiritual meaning in life, which can be shaped through connection to others, working with others. And this can be an ever evolving process. And what I see with a lot of my clients with mid to long-term recovery is a real appreciation for the smaller things in life. As I mentioned earlier, addiction is traumatic, and to get a bit of time up in recovery and to build these relationships and have a sense of meaning and sometimes a real sense of purpose that might be emerging from their work or their study or something new in their life, we see that there's sometimes a desire to give back. There's other times a deep sense of gratitude. And I love it when I see this because it absolutely warms my heart. And certainly that cyclical process that you find in 12-step programs where it's one addict helping another. So as I'm talking to clinicians, support workers, people working in the field, how do we start to bring PTG into our work with trauma survivors? As I very briefly touched on, it's not an automatic start working with someone and bringing up post-traumatic growth. I would never do this. I would be thinking strengths-based, and that is very simply the safety of the individual, both physical and personal sense of safety. If this is overlooked and we jump into addressing the trauma, it can be re-traumatizing for that individual. So we're working with that person to ensure a sense of safety. They have the ability to emotionally regulate and ground. So all of those really important grassroots elements of working with people need to be in place before we touch the trauma. The treatment setting that I was affiliated with for a very long time in Thailand, clients would have to undergo 1 month of the treatment program before they would be placed on the trauma track to ensure that that person had enough skills and strengths to be able to start to unpack some of the trauma. And when I say unpack, sometimes narrative therapy is not the answer for trauma. I've had survivors that have been in a lot of therapy and have recounted their trauma stories so many times over that it has no meaning to them anymore. And then other times it's a really integral piece of processing that trauma. Sometimes we use techniques such as EMDR and psychodrama, and lots of different cutting edge trauma treatments can be utilized at this point. Addressing the trauma doesn't necessarily mean let's go back and relive it. It's very client dependent. And I find that my clients in mid to longer term recovery, after this processing has occurred, they're sort of like, well, what now? And that's where I like to focus. First, how does trauma manifest in your life today? Because that is one of the key areas of focus for people in more of a midterm recovery. What's coming up for them in their life that can be linked back to the trauma. So it's not a case of, in many instances, even discussing the trauma with me. It's, yes, I have an awareness of what happened, but it's very much in the here and now. And utilizing those areas of PTG and asking a client to consider this can be very hopeful. We're going to switch gears a little bit here to an area that I find fascinating. I had never heard of vicarious post-traumatic growth until I was undertaking resilience research, and I sort of stumbled into this. And I found this research, and just a side note, I've mentioned research multiple times at this point, and I'm going to share a bunch of links at the end of this session that will be in the comments. So for those of you that would like to have a look at some of the research that I have mentioned, you can have links to the articles themselves. But there is a small body of work around vicarious post-traumatic growth. And I'd like to give an example to highlight this. When I first moved to Thailand, I had come from a background of psychological well-being, Fortune 500 psychology. So I was working with organizations and I wanted the experience in trauma. And that is precisely what I got. And I found that in the early days, sometimes it was a lot emotionally. I would come home after work, I would put my bag on the floor and I would just cry because of what I'd heard was quite distressing. And I was really fortunate because I worked with an amazing clinical team with a lot more experience than me, that I could really lean into and get skills and supports, not only for me to manage that personally and professionally, but also to ask a lot of questions too. And I look back on that time as the biggest learning stage in my life, not just professionally, but also personally. And that came from working with trauma. I always find it interesting, sometimes people's responses when you tell them that you work with trauma. Everything from, why would you want to do this? And also, that must be really hard. Or my father, when I first told him I wanted to be a trauma therapist, says to me, I fully support you, but why on earth would you want to spend your life at the coalface of human suffering? Was the way that he framed it. Now, my dad is a landscape architect, so we don't have the same lens on the world. I don't see working with trauma like that at all. In fact, I get front row center seats to the strength of the human spirit to survive, sometimes against all odds. And I find that to be both powerful and incredibly moving. And I've grown as a human because of this work. And that's essentially what vicarious post-traumatic growth is all about. I'm also going to drop this link into the comments here for all of you to do the post-traumatic growth inventory, also created by Tedeschi and Calhoun as a way of attempting to measure PTG. And I'd like you to consider, do you find this helpful? What are the strengths and weaknesses of this? I feel like there's some really good discussions occurring in the addiction space about whether this is a helpful tool. So I'm looking forward to any comments that you can add as well to the discussion and see what you think about this tool. Because working with trauma presents challenges, and linking back to what I said earlier, Trauma is incredibly common globally. Many of us will survive at least one big T trauma event in our lives. And so, in the context of today's day and age, when people have trauma, it becomes one of the challenges when presented with someone you're working with. And an example for me of this was I did some work in the human rights space in 2019 in Myanmar. And I was working on developing programs that were helpful for social workers there. And my very first time in Myanmar was meeting these incredibly inspiring individuals and asking them, what is it that you need? What is it that you want me to develop? And then from those meetings, I went away, developed a program, and I delivered it to managers, trainers, social workers, and it was translated in Burmese as well as me delivering it in English. Those resources went to them, and then they took that out into the communities. And I was so privileged to have met this inspiring group of individuals, many of whom had significant trauma in their early lives, followed by working in conflict regions in Myanmar, so further trauma in a lot of instances, and yet they still put themselves at the front line. And that construction of meaning and post-traumatic growth that we see was so evident in this group. But it is challenging. What if that person has experienced trauma that's very similar to you? So for people working with trauma, it's a double-edged sword. Also because of empathy and compassion. And I remember early in the piece, I'd been working for about 9 months in the trauma space, and I was feeling quite almost detached from what was occurring. And I think that's because I'm a relatively empathetic person. So when you tell me something sad, I'm going to connect to it. And this is the process of empathy. It doesn't mean I'm going to feel the same level of sadness, but there's that connection. And what researchers tell us is that the neuronal pathways that are responsible for this process are mirror neurons. And this is learnt very early on in the piece when a child is being nursed by mostly their mother, but can be primary carer, and there is eye contact through that process. The child looks into the mother's eyes, the mother looks into the baby's eyes, and neurons fire at the same time, essentially creating empathy. And we see this in adults, people's body language matching and mirroring each other. And so we are capable of a wide range of emotions and also feeling just a little bit of what that person feels. Sometimes for professionals working with trauma, they might experience a detachment or a disengagement, and it's often due to this process becoming overwhelming. And this is essentially where the tension lies. A lot of you will be familiar with Jung's term wounded healer. And I've always loved this expression to really capture a lot of what we've been talking about from a professional lens. Many people are compelled to work in areas that they themselves have had lived experiences of. And Jung used this term to describe psychoanalysts that worked with individuals essentially and healing their own wounds in the same process. And I smile when I say this because you don't need to be a psychotherapist in order to be a wounded healer. I find with my work with corporate and Fortune 500s, I hear from people who are the go-to person on their team, the person that all their family members rely on, friends call them in a crisis. There are wounded healers in all areas. And working with trauma survivors, one of the growth areas I've seen is the heightened development of emotional intelligence. Sometimes we can become more empathetic. We see feelings and emotions. We read nonverbal cues, body language, facial expressions in a much more advanced way than other people who have perhaps have not had lived experiences of trauma. And so I see emotional intelligence, empathy, active listening skills, and also sometimes a deep desire to help others. But vicarious trauma, burnout, and compassion fatigue are very real and are heightened in areas that work with trauma. Also, this can be captured in emergency services and frontline responders. And it is the residual exposure of traumatic stories. When we are at the front line, when we witness or we hear about these stories, it can have a profound effect. Sometimes sleep might be affected. We might detach and disengage. Other times it presents very similarly to burnout, where there is a state of complete exhaustion. What's the difference? So compassion fatigue is caused by secondary trauma. And interestingly, we started to see levels of vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue be heightened globally after September 11th. There were all of these people globally that were watching the reports. We couldn't avoid it. Those images were put on the news and played over and over and over again. So all these people around the world that were A, not American, B, had nothing to do with ground zero, were experiencing symptoms of trauma. And this was vicarious trauma. And the same thing happened through COVID. And we are empathetic humans. So for those of us working with trauma, this is particularly relevant. Burnout, on the other hand, is a stress-related disorder. It's not directly linked to trauma, although it certainly can happen for trauma therapists and people working with trauma. The most important thing to be considering is no one just wakes up one day with burnout. It's a progression and there are signs. So understanding your signs and how this might present with you is really important. I remember those early days of working with trauma, and I mentioned before feeling disconnected. And I had a client approach me in the treatment setting, and he wasn't one of my clients, but he wanted to exit treatment because his father was dying. And I said everything correctly. We had a conversation and I walked away and I thought to myself, I don't feel anything. And that was unusual because I am an empathetic person. And I was very fortunate because I'd already applied for some leave. And a few days later, my father flew into Chiang Mai and we spent time on an elephant eco reserve and did zip lining. And I came back feeling fully charged. Now, the takeaway from that is not elephants cure burnout, but more social connections certainly do. And it is about recognizing your signs early on in the piece before we get to breaking point. So coming to the group now, and all of you listening to this, have a think about what does a little bit, moderate amount, and I may be edging towards burnout look like for you. I often ask the globe in sessions, how does stress present for you? And even last week I was hearing comments such as, my eczema flares up, my asthma gets worse. So there are physical symptoms as a direct result of stress. There might be emotional symptoms. There's a whole range of signs and symptoms. So what do you recognize in this list? Sometimes we might feel powerless. We might feel really hopeless. We might disconnect and disengage, as I mentioned. There's also cognitive confusion, which is the clinical term for the brain under stress. You might sit down to undertake a task that normally takes 20 minutes, but it takes an hour to complete the same task. For those of you that are very accurate with a high attention to detail, you might be noticing small errors in your work. This might be a sign. So we might be emotional, reactive, or we might withdraw, depends on the individual. We might have our beautiful self-care program just fall to the wayside and think, I couldn't be bothered, I'm exhausted, I don't care anymore. We might have conflict in our relationships, whether that's our professional or personal relationships. Thinking about how do you recognize the signs? And these are some of the key areas. Now, for those of you that are in a clinical field, this is not going to be groundbreaking information for you. You know this. And if that does apply to you, I'd like you to consider, why is it that a lot of clinicians don't implement what we're quite happy to talk to other people about? because I've met clinicians that have amazing self-care and resilience strategies in place. They're very dedicated to their exercise routines, their nutrition. They limit social media. They have a really good support network around them. They practice mindfulness, meditation. There's a technique I've been using at the moment that I've found excellent, NSDR, non-sleep deep rest. If you put NSDR protocol into YouTube, you will find Andrew Huberman, who is a neurobiologist and has amazing podcasts, talking you through a 10-minute protocol. Now, NSDR sounds very fancy for Yoga Nidra. Some of you will be familiar with Yoga Nidra, but any of these types of techniques can be really helpful for managing our stress. Stanford University did a study on the best breathing techniques to regulate the nervous system, and they found that the physiological sigh is really helpful. So inhaling through your nose deeply, inhaling again, and then exhaling through your mouth like a sigh. And that's the physiological sigh. We can do this in the moment. We can do this directly after seeing a client. We can journal. We can write gratitude lists. We can do some type of holistic activity. There is no right or wrong in building resilience and creating a self-care toolbox. It's going to be largely dependent on you. What do you have time for? What do you enjoy? What works for you? But it's still very important that we have something in play. And that last point as well. Sometimes professionals neglect their own needs because they're focused on the needs of others. How often and also how do you celebrate your successes, celebrating the wins of working with clients? So in conclusion, trauma does bring us into a higher risk of vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and burnout. It's quite simple. If we are working with trauma, we are more at risk. And we see this as well with people in the legal professions and other professions that are also working with trauma that are not necessarily in a clinical capacity. There is no one size fits all because we are all individual and unique and different, but it's important that we explore what are those strategies that are going to work best for us. And that self-care is critical. I love the expression, you cannot pour from an empty cup. You cannot be the best version of you for everybody else in your world if you're running on empty. I wrote a little academic article that really delves into post-traumatic growth, also in an addictions field. So for those of you that might like a little read and to check out also some of those really important research studies that are being done, I have a huge list of references at the back for you to explore. And for those of you that might be interested in some of my research findings from Cambodia, you can find a list of publications on my ResearchGate profile. You can basically just put my name into Google and I'll pop up all over the place. So do connect with me, reach out. I'd love to hear your thoughts on post-traumatic growth and whether you found that tool useful. And that brings me to the end. Thank you all so much for listening to this today. And I really hope you got something helpful and useful out of it. Bye for now.